Hello and welcome. If you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the little bell so you don't miss future stories and gentle lessons. And now, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day fade behind you. You're safe, you're warm, and you're ready to listen. This is not just a lecture. It's a calm journey through time and thought, one that will take you from the earliest moments of human learning all the way to the future of how we grow and change. And we begin with something very simple, a question. Long before humans built cities, before we carved symbols, before we even had words, we were watching. A leaf blowing in the wind, an animal moving through the grass, a stone rolling down a hill. And somewhere, in one of those ancient minds, a thought began to form. Why? That quiet wondering was the beginning of everything. Humans are not the strongest species, nor the fastest. We don't have sharp claws or thick fur. What we have is a brain that wants to understand. We are born to learn, not just for survival, but because we are drawn to the unknown. Even as infants, we reach, touch, taste, explore. We mimic, we test, we play. Not because someone teaches us to, but because something inside us needs to. This is curiosity, and it is one of the oldest instincts we have. For early humans, learning was not a choice. It was a necessity. To survive, they had to understand which plants could heal and which could harm. They had to remember paths, recognize patterns in the stars, know when the rains would come and where the animals would move. Each discovery helped them adapt. Each mistake taught them caution. And with every generation, knowledge grew, passed from voice to voice in stories, songs, rituals, and tools. This natural hunger to know, to figure things out, is what shaped our species. It allowed us to create fire, to build shelters, to make maps, to ask not only what is this, but also what if. And over time, we didn't just learn, we learned how to learn. In this lecture, we'll explore how humans began this journey. We'll look at the earliest ways of learning through imitation, exploration, and storytelling. We'll follow the rise of memory, tools, language, and ritual. We'll see how schools were born, how books changed everything, and how today, learning is faster and more connected than ever. But it all begins with a spark, a question, a pause, a breath, and that moment when you look at the world and feel something inside whisper, "I want to understand." That is the beginning of being human. So, lie back, breathe gently, and come with me into the soft, ancient path of learning. Before we spoke, before we named the world around us, we were still learning, not through books or speech, but through watching, through moving, through being alive in a living world. To understand where learning begins, we must return to a time when the only teacher was the world itself. Long before humans could speak, they could see. They watched the movement of clouds, the bending of trees in the wind, the way animals crept, paused, fled, or attacked. They watched their mothers gather, their fathers shape tools, their siblings play and fall and try again. Learning was not a subject, it was a way of being. And in this, humans were not alone. All animals learn. A lion cub learns to stalk. A young bird learns to fly. A baby elephant learns the path to water. But most of this learning is guided by instinct. Deep programs in the brain written by evolution. Human beings are different. We are born more helpless and more open. A newborn deer can stand within minutes. A human infant takes more than a year to walk. But that vulnerability gives us time to absorb, to adapt, to imitate. Our learning is not only what we inherit, but what we observe. This is called observational learning, watching others and repeating what they do. A child sees someone crack a nut with a stone and tries to do the same. They don't need a lesson. They need exposure, time, repetition. And through this, humans began to build something animals rarely do: culture. Culture is shared knowledge that goes beyond instinct. It is passed down, expanded, refined. Chimpanzees use tools, and some birds mimic sounds, but human culture accumulates. It grows larger with each generation. Because we don't just copy what we see, we build upon it. We try new things. We fail. We remember. And we teach others. In the wild, early humans learned which berries were safe, which animals were dangerous, which places were sacred. They learned to read the weather, follow the stars, listen to the patterns of bird calls and silence. And they did all of this without language. Their minds were tuned to the environment, like instruments, sensitive to every movement, sound, and rhythm. This kind of learning requires deep attention, patience, trust in the senses. Even today, some of our most profound learning comes in silence. When we watch the sky, follow a trail, try something new with our hands. Before words, humans learned as the forest learns, through presence, through instinct, through the slow, living memory of the land. And that ancient way of learning is still within us. When you figure something out on your own, when you mimic without being told, when you feel something click without needing explanation, you are learning as your ancestors once did. Before words, before schools, before everything else. In the wild, learning began with watching, but watching was not enough. What mattered most was what we could keep, because the world didn't stop to explain itself. It moved on, and if we wanted to survive, we had to carry what we saw inside us. The human brain is not the biggest in the animal kingdom, but it is among the most adaptable, and one of its most powerful abilities is the gift of memory. Memory is the thread that connects moment to moment, past to future. Without it, there would be no learning, only instinct, only reaction. With memory, we can carry knowledge forward, not just what happened, but what might happen next. There are many kinds of memory. Procedural memory, learning how to do things with your body, like walking, weaving, lighting a fire. Declarative memory, remembering facts, names, places. Emotional memory, how an experience felt, and how that feeling helps us decide what to do next. Early humans used all three. They remembered which food tasted bitter, which path led home, which rhythm kept the fire alive. They repeated movements again and again until the body knew them without thought. This is pattern learning, finding repetition in the world and mirroring it within ourselves. Nature itself is made of patterns, day and night, the cycle of seasons, the steps of a hunt, the marks of a foot in mud. The brain learns by recognizing these shapes and predicting what comes next. Each time we repeat an action, a connection in the brain strengthens. Like tracing a line in the sand over and over until it becomes a path. This is called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change itself with experience. And emotion makes this even more powerful. We remember what frightens us, what surprises us, what moves us. A joyful discovery is easier to recall than a dull one. A painful lesson is hard to forget. Emotion tags memory as important. This is why storytelling, music, and rhythm have always been part of human learning. They engage both the mind and the heart. When memory is tied to feeling, it becomes durable. It lasts. And this is not new. Even 50,000 years ago, early humans likely sang or chanted to pass down knowledge. not just because it sounded nice, but because it helped them remember. So when you learn something today, whether it's a word, a skill, or a truth, you are continuing a very ancient process. You are letting your brain write a new path, etching it into the soft clay of who you are. With each repetition, each feeling, each gentle return, that path becomes clearer. Until one day, what was once new becomes part of you. That is memory. And that is the quiet magic of how we grow. Memory let us hold the world inside. But memory alone wasn't enough. We had to do more than remember. We had to act, to try, to touch and change the world around us. Long before schools or lessons, before books or speech, humans learned with their hands. We are creatures of movement, of contact. And our greatest teachers were not people, but objects, and how they responded to our touch. A stone that cracked in half, a stick that bent but didn't break, a fire that flared when fed, then faded in silence. This was learning by doing. It was not neat or structured. It was messy, full of mistakes. But every mistake was a message. Every failure taught us something new. This process is known as trial and error, one of the oldest and most powerful ways to learn. You try. Something happens. You adjust and try again. This is how we discovered how to sharpen a rock, how to make a fire spark, how to carry water in a curved leaf or hollow shell. The hands were not just tools, they were thinking instruments. Modern science shows that our brain and our hands developed together. The more we used them, the more complex our thinking became. When early humans began to make tools, even something as simple as a sharp flake of stone, they were doing something revolutionary. They were solving problems, understanding cause and effect, asking in their own way, if I do this, what happens? Tool making required planning, memory, and imagination. It marked a shift from reacting to the world to shaping it. The oldest known stone tools date back over 2.5 million years. Found in Africa, they were likely made by Homo habilis, sometimes called handy man. These early tools were simple, but they opened the door to more complex thinking, and not just thinking, teaching. One person could show another how to strike a stone at just the right angle to produce a sharp edge. They didn't need words. They needed demonstration. And this was the beginning of shared problem solving, of building knowledge together. As time passed, tools became more specialized. Blades, scrapers, axes, needles. Each new shape was a new solution to a new challenge. And with every object we shaped ourselves. Because to learn by doing is to change both the world and the mind. Even now, we learn best when we engage with something. When we build, test, fix, play. Hands still teach. Mistakes still guide. Action still reveals. So when you try something new and it doesn't work, you are not failing. You are learning the way humans always have, by doing. We shaped the world with our hands. But not all learning comes from doing. Some of it begins in stillness, in watching, in mirroring, in quietly becoming what we see. From the moment we are born, our eyes search for faces. We look, we study, we copy. This is one of the oldest forms of learning, and one of the most powerful. Known as social learning, it allows us to learn not just from experience, but from the experiences of others. When you watch someone build a shelter, hunt, gather, cook, sing, your brain is not just observing, it is rehearsing. Inside your head, neurons fire as if you are performing the action. These are called mirror neurons. They allow us to learn by imitation. They also allow us to feel empathy, to understand others by simulating their actions, their pain, their joy. This ability may be one of the reasons why humans are so deeply social, and why we are able to teach without speaking a word. For early humans, this was essential. A child would watch how their mother carried wood, cracked nuts, soothed a younger sibling. They would watch how their father sharpened tools, read the sky, followed tracks in the soil. Every gesture was a lesson, and those lessons were everywhere. Not in schools, but in fire circles, in rivers, in forests. This is sometimes called enculturation, learning by simply growing up in a specific community. No lectures, no assignments, just attention and time. Parents and elders played a key role. They didn't just protect, they modeled. They showed what mattered, what worked, what lasted. They taught through repetition, ritual, and rhythm. And children, by watching, absorbed it all. In many indigenous cultures today, this kind of teaching still thrives. Children participate in daily life by observing and joining in at their own pace. There is no separation between learning and living. And perhaps that's the most ancient truth about education. It is not something done to us. It is something we enter, something we shape just by being there. So when we sit quietly, watch someone's hands move, or listen without interrupting, we are learning in the old way, the deep way. The way passed down not through books, but through presence. And even now, the eyes of a child still hold the same hunger to understand what the body remembers before the mind explains. We watched. We copied. We tried. We remembered. But somewhere in that long stretch of time, a new kind of learning emerged. Not just from doing, not just from watching, but from listening, and from those who carried stories like torches in the dark. Before schools, before scrolls, before ink touched paper, there were people who remembered. They remembered how the stars moved and when the rains would come. They remembered which plants healed and which ones harmed. They remembered where the animals went in winter and which spirits lived in the trees. These people became the first teachers. They weren't assigned. They were trusted, chosen by time and remembered by generations. In many early societies, elders held this sacred role. Their years brought not just experience, but perspective. They had seen enough seasons to know what lasts, what matters, what repeats. And they passed this on through stories. Because before humans wrote anything down, we spoke our knowledge into tales, not dry facts, but living narratives, full of rhythm, emotion, characters, and meaning. This is oral tradition, a way of preserving and teaching that has lasted for tens of thousands of years. These stories taught how to find food, how to treat wounds, how to honor the dead, how to love, how to survive. And they were told not only around fires, but through rituals. Rituals were more than ceremonies. They were embodied lessons. A dance that mirrored the hunt. A chant that followed the moon. A gesture that welcomed the new and honored the old. Through ritual, knowledge became experience. It wasn't just taught, it was felt. And myth, those ancient, shimmering stories about gods, animals, spirits, and ancestors, was not fantasy. It was coded wisdom. Metaphor became a vessel, a way to carry truths too big, too delicate, too sacred for direct speech. In this world, learning was not separate from life. It was woven into everyday moments. And those who carried the stories were seen not just as wise, but as essential. The memory of a people lived inside their voices. Even today, many indigenous and traditional societies still hold this form of teaching sacred. A grandmother's story, a ceremony under stars, a song passed from one voice to the next. These are not relics. They are roots. Because even in our fast digital world, When a child leans close to hear a story before bed, they are doing what children have done for tens of thousands of years. They are listening. They are remembering. They are learning. And in that moment, they are being taught by the very first teachers humanity ever knew. The first teachers used their voices. But it wasn't only the voice that taught. It was what the voice carried. Not commands, not facts, but something deeper. A world inside a story. Imagine this. A child sits by the fire. Around them, shadows dance on the cave wall, and someone begins to speak, not to give instructions, not to recite a list, but to tell a story. In that moment, the child's brain lights up, not just in the areas for hearing, but for seeing, feeling, moving, imagining. Because stories activate the whole mind. They don't just pass information, they shape it. This is one of the most ancient ways humans have ever learned, and it's still one of the most powerful. Stories help us make sense of time, action, emotion, decision. They create a beginning, a middle, an end. They give us structure, a way to hold complexity without losing it. Before there were maps, people described landscapes in stories. Before there were laws, they shared values through legends. Before science, there were myths that explained why the sun rose, why it rained, why we dream. And these stories worked because they didn't just speak to the brain, they spoke to the heart. A warning about danger becomes more powerful when told through a tale. A child wandered too far from the fire and was taken by the spirits in the woods. The story becomes a container for truth, fear, and memory. And the child remembers. This is how stories teach morals, how they help children and adults understand right from wrong, safe from unsafe. They are not lectures, they are mirrors, and they also unlock something uniquely human: imagination. Through stories, we learn to step outside ourselves, to imagine different lives, different outcomes, different choices. We feel what it's like to be brave, to fail, to forgive, to try again. And this ability to imagine is what allows us to plan, innovate, change. Neuroscientists believe that when we hear a story, our brain simulates the events inside it. It rehearses, prepares, understands. So in a very real way, every story we hear makes us wiser, safer, more human. For tens of thousands of years, stories were the main tool for preserving knowledge. They were passed from voice to voice, parent to child, generation to generation. Some lasted longer than entire civilizations. And even now, when we sit down with a film, a book, a bedtime tale, we are doing what humans have always done. We are learning through story. Stories taught us what happened, but something else taught us what could happen. Not through lessons, not through rules, but through something joyful, something small hands do without asking permission, through play. Play is not a distraction. It's not just fun. It's not the opposite of learning. It is learning. For children, play is how the brain tests ideas in a world that feels safe. It is how we explore the rules before we have to follow them. From the earliest moments of life, children reach, roll, crawl, grasp, build, drop, and repeat. They play with sound, with rhythm, with faces and shapes and shadows. Each game, each pretend moment, each playful movement is a kind of research. Scientists now know that play develops parts of the brain responsible for planning, creativity, problem-solving, and emotional regulation. It builds flexibility. It builds resilience. It builds mind. In early human societies, play wasn't limited to toys. There were no plastic pieces or digital screens, but there were sticks, stones, shapes in the mud, patterns in the sand. Children turned bones into dolls, leaves into boats, footprints into paths. They mimicked the adults, reenacted the hunt, made their own rules, and then broke them to see what would happen. This is called exploratory play, a way to experiment with logic, movement, and interaction. Through it, children learned risk without real danger. They learned structure through rules they created themselves. Even animals play. Wolves, dolphins, apes. They chase, tumble, tease, and invent games. But human play is different. It's not just physical. It's also symbolic. We imagine things that don't exist. We create invisible friends, invent languages, build worlds from nothing but thought and movement. This kind of play is what gives rise to abstract thought, to art, to mathematics, to science, to philosophy. In play, we simulate, we pretend, we try on roles, and we begin to understand what it feels like to be someone else. This is why play is essential to empathy, to creativity, to innovation. Even in adulthood, we continue to learn best when there is room for play. In brainstorming, in designing, in solving problems, the sandbox of the mind remains open. And when we give children space to play freely, without fear of failure, we are doing more than entertaining them. We are honoring one of the oldest, deepest, most human ways of growing. So let us never forget, play is not what we do when the learning is done. It is how the learning begins. Play gave us space to explore. But with every exploration comes something else. Something sharp, unexpected, sometimes painful. Mistakes. But in the long history of learning, mistakes are not the end. They are the beginning of something deeper. No one learns without failing. Even the simplest act, grasping a stone, balancing on 2 feet, making a fire, began with mistakes. And early humans made many. They burned food, broke tools, got lost, chose the wrong path. But the brain didn't treat failure as defeat. It treated it as information. Modern neuroscience shows that when we make a mistake, specific areas of the brain light up. There is a burst of attention, a moment of awareness. It's as if the brain says, "Something didn't work. Let's figure out why." This process is essential to what psychologists call learning loops. We try, we fail, we reflect, we adjust, we try again. And each time, the brain rewires just a little. This is how mastery is built. Not in a straight line, but through spirals of attempt and correction. Mistakes strengthen learning more than immediate success ever can, because they require us to pause, to think, to try something new. In fact, research shows that people who struggle a little during learning often retain the material longer than those who get it right the first time. Failure creates depth. It also creates something harder to measure, but just as important: resilience. When early humans faced failure, they had 2 options: give up or try again. Those who tried again passed on not just knowledge, but a mindset, a quiet understanding that falling is part of moving forward, that pain is part of growth. In traditional communities, this idea still holds strong. A child is not punished for failing. They are encouraged to try again. Adults model their own failures. They laugh at mistakes. They tell stories of things gone wrong and what they learned. Because in those stories, there is power. And in each mistake, a small invitation to get closer, to understand better, to become wiser. So as you listen tonight, remember this: every time you stumbled, hesitated, got it wrong, you were learning in the oldest, most human way, through trying, through error, through the slow, beautiful spiral toward understanding. Mistakes gave birth to mastery, but memory needed something more, something that could hold knowledge outside the body, something that could stay even when the teacher was gone. And so we began to leave marks. A long time ago, people didn't write. They didn't use books or screens or even words, but they still learned. They learned by watching faces, by copying movements, and by passing skills from hand to hand. Then something changed. One day, someone picked up a sharp stone, looked at a wall, and carved a line. Not to cut, not to decorate, but to mean something. That moment was the beginning of symbols, the beginning of abstract thought. People started making marks, dots, spirals, hands, and lines. These weren't just pictures. They were ideas. A pattern in bone might show the moon's cycle. A row of dots might mean days. A handprint might say, "I was here." These simple signs were not full writing, but they were the first step. The step from seeing to imagining. Humans began to think about things that weren't there. A number, a direction, a dream. And this helped us build systems. Time, trade, maps, measurement. When people started watching the stars and drawing what they saw, they were turning the world into a kind of language. And that language wasn't just spoken. It was painted, carved, tied in knots, drawn in sand. In Africa, red lines in caves are over 70,000 years old. In Europe, ancient cave art still glows after 17,000 years. And in Indonesia, handprints reach to us from even further back. They weren't just art, they were messages. Messages for others and for the future. Symbols helped us remember more than we could hold in our minds. They helped us share. They helped us teach. These were the ancestors of writing, of numbers, of diagrams, of alphabets. But even more than that, they showed something powerful. That humans were not only living in the world, they were describing it. They were turning thoughts into form, and form into meaning. So today, when you make a list, or draw a symbol, or leave a small message for someone, remember, you are doing something ancient. You are using the same magic. You are shaping the world with your mind. Imagine a group sitting under stars. A fire glows in the center. Voices rise and fall in rhythm. No books, no screens, no paper. And yet, this is a library. A library made of people. For tens of thousands of years, human knowledge was passed down not through writing, but through words. Oral tradition, stories, songs, chants, proverbs, each carefully shaped to be remembered, each carrying lessons, warnings, hopes. In many societies, this oral memory was collective. It didn't belong to one person, but to the group. Some remembered the stars, some knew the plants, some held the stories of birth and death. Others remembered trade routes, rituals, songs for healing. Knowledge was divided, not to separate, but to preserve. It was woven into roles. Hunters knew the animals. Midwives knew the signs of labor. Elders held the history. Children learned through play and listening. Each person became a keeper of one thread in a larger web. And together, that web became culture. This shared learning was more than survival. It created identity. When you knew your stories, your ceremonies, your tools and songs, you knew who you were. This is why colonization and forced assimilation have always attacked language and tradition first. Because to erase collective knowledge is to unravel belonging. But collective learning isn't just about the past. Even now, we learn best together. In classrooms, in families, in circles of friends, sharing what they've read, what they've tried, what they believe. We build understanding through dialogue. We compare, we challenge, we pass it on. Modern science confirms this. Brains become more active when we teach someone else than when we just listen. Because in teaching, we reflect, we connect, we encode memory into something bigger. So when a grandparent tells a story, when a child repeats a song, when two people sit and wonder together, they are not just exchanging words. They are building knowledge. Knowledge that is not owned but shared. A kind of memory made not of neurons, but of community. And that, perhaps, is the deepest kind of learning of all. Learning began in the wild. It grew in firelight and forests. It passed through stories, songs, rituals, and signs. But then came cities, temples, governments, and with them, a new question. How do we teach many? The word school might bring to mind chalkboards, desks, books, and bells. But the first schools looked very different. They were often temples, places of worship, ritual, and power. Because the first teachers were often priests, scribes, and scholars, people trusted to speak for gods, or kings, or both. Formal education didn't begin as a universal right. It began as a privilege and a tool. In ancient Sumer, more than 4,000 years ago, boys from elite families were taught to write on clay tablets using a stylus. They memorized long lists, names, goods, laws, stars. In ancient Egypt, scribes trained in temple schools to record offerings, taxes, prayers. They learned hieroglyphs not just as language, but as sacred script. In ancient China, As early as 2,000 years ago, students studied Confucian texts to prepare for service in government. Discipline, loyalty, and proper behavior were as important as reading. In ancient India, Gurukulas offered instruction in Sanskrit, mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and ritual. Pupils lived with their teacher, sharing daily life as well as knowledge. And in ancient Greece, philosophers began asking not just what is known, but how do we know it? They studied logic, rhetoric, ethics, geometry, music, and movement. Education became not just about function, but about forming the mind. These early schools laid the foundations for what we now call curriculum. But they also came with rules. Who could learn? What was worth knowing? Who decided? Most early schools were limited to boys, to elites, to the sons of power. Girls, laborers, farmers, and the poor often learned through older methods, from family, craft, experience. This divide created tension, formal versus informal learning, sacred versus practical knowledge. But both forms remained vital, because schools could teach theory, but life still taught through action. Still, the rise of schools marked a turning point in human history. It meant that knowledge could be structured, collected, standardized, passed to more people faster. It meant that learning was no longer left to chance, but became a choice. And as more civilizations rose, so did their schools. Not always perfect, not always fair, but always driven by the same quiet force that moved the first question in the first human mind: a need to know, to understand, to pass it on. We built temples of learning, but inside those walls, another kind of curiosity began to grow, not just about people, but about the sky, the land, the hidden rules beneath everything, a desire to read not books, but the world itself. Before there were libraries, there were landscapes. Before textbooks, there were stars. Before blackboards, there was the earth itself. And early humans were not blind to its patterns. They watched shadows shift as the sun moved. They counted the days between rains. They followed stars across endless skies. These were the first sciences, not named as such, but practiced with quiet precision. Long before the term astronomy, people built structures aligned with the heavens. Stonehenge in Britain, Nabta Playa in Africa, Chanquillo in Peru. They tracked the solstices, the seasons, the return of light. They didn't just look up, they measured. And in that measurement, something changed. They moved from guessing to observing, from myth to method. At the same time, people began to map not just the stars, but the land. Lines in sand became directions. Stones became landmarks. Rivers became routes. And slowly, maps were born. The oldest known map, a clay tablet from Mesopotamia, dates back more than 2,500 years. It shows a world imagined as a circle, with Babylon at its center. Even earlier than that, humans used memory maps, mental landscapes encoded in song, story, or dance. And while maps gave direction, numbers gave structure. Counting was likely born out of trade and seasons. How many sheep, how many days, how much grain. The Ishango bone from Central Africa, carved with tally marks, is over 20,000 years old. In Sumer, more than 4,000 years ago, people developed systems of weights and measures, the beginning of mathematics as a formal study. In India, concepts of zero and infinity emerged with stunning clarity. In Greece, geometry became a way to explore truth and logic. And through all of it, humans were learning to see the world as a system, not just as a stage for myth, but as a structure of forces, patterns, and relationships. These early sciences were not perfect. They were mixed with astrology, magic, and spiritual beliefs. But at their heart was something essential: observation, curiosity, pattern seeking. The same instincts that helped a child build with stones were now building ideas that could explain the movement of the moon, the rhythm of disease, the cycle of the tides. We were not just learning to survive, we were learning to understand, and in doing so, we stretched the mind beyond family, beyond tribe, beyond gods, toward the stars, the soil, the infinite, toward a world that could be read with eyes, with tools, and with thought. We mapped the stars. We counted the harvest. We learned by watching the sky and listening to the earth. But at some point, the lessons we carried needed more than memory. They needed pages. When humans first carved symbols into bone or painted animals on cave walls, they were not just making art. They were reaching for something lasting, something that could survive the speaker, the listener, even the story itself. This is what writing gave us, not just a way to speak, but a way to remember with precision. And with it came a new kind of teacher, the written word. Books became teachers that never grew tired. Scrolls held voices long after the speaker was gone. Tablets carried instructions, laws, poems, prayers, etched in stone, burned into clay, pressed into skin and paper. The first known writing systems appeared over 5,000 years ago. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs in Egypt, oracle bone script in ancient China. They were used for record-keeping, rituals, trade. But over time, writing expanded. It became a tool for ideas. In Greece, philosophy and mathematics were copied by hand and passed through generations. In India, sacred texts were written on palm leaves, tied with thread, and protected with reverence. In the Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to 13th century, scholars in Baghdad translated Greek, Persian, Indian, and Roman works into Arabic. They built vast libraries like the House of Wisdom. In China, woodblock printing began more than 1,200 years ago, allowing for mass reproduction of texts. And then, in 15th century Europe, the printing press changed everything. Knowledge could now travel faster than armies, farther than merchants, deeper than borders. And for the first time in history, a book could reach someone the author never met. Reading became a silent form of listening. It allowed people to study alone, in their own time, at their own pace. Books became portable teachers, whispers across centuries, lessons wrapped in ink and page. Libraries rose as temples of learning, places where the world's memory could be stored, shared, protected. And with each book copied or printed, with each scroll passed hand to hand, knowledge became a little less exclusive, a little more democratic, no longer just for priests or princes or scholars, but for anyone who could read. Of course, barriers remained, of class, of language, of power. But the idea had taken root. That knowledge was not a secret. It was a gift. And the written word made that gift endlessly repeatable. Even today, in a world of screens and sound, a book remains one of the most profound ways to learn, because inside its quiet form still lives a voice, waiting to be heard by someone ready to listen. We wrote, we read, we built temples of thought and roads of reason. But as the mind grew wiser, it began to turn inward, not just to ask, what do I know? But, how do I know it? And how can I know more? To learn is one thing. To understand how we learn is another. This is the beginning of something called metacognition, thinking about thinking. It sounds modern, scientific, even clinical. But in truth, it began the moment a child tried one way, failed, and then tried another. It began when ancient farmers noticed which seeds grew best, when healers remembered not just the remedy, but the reason it worked. It began when we stopped simply reacting and started reflecting. In early education, learning was often about repetition, rote memorization, reciting, copying. But slowly, human beings began to realize that repetition alone wasn't enough. Understanding required more. It required strategy. And so we developed tools, categorization, visualization, analogies, diagrams, questions, summaries. We began to teach not just facts, but how to approach facts. And with it, we trained the mind to notice itself. This is what makes learning so powerful. It's not just accumulation, it's adaptation. A mind that knows how to learn can face the unknown with curiosity instead of fear. Metacognition gives us the ability to recognize confusion, pause, rethink, and choose another path. It turns instinct into method. In modern science, studies show that people who reflect on how they study, what they remember, and why something was difficult, tend to learn more effectively, because they are building not just knowledge, but awareness. And awareness is what transforms information into wisdom. Even children can develop this. When asked, "What helped you learn that?" or "What would you try next time?" they begin to form mental mirrors. They don't just do, they see themselves doing. And that self-awareness can last a lifetime. It teaches humility, flexibility, patience. It also teaches that failure is not the opposite of learning, but part of its rhythm. So in the long journey of knowledge, from the caves to the cosmos, one of the greatest discoveries was not out in the world, but inside us. That we are not just learners, we are learning beings, capable not only of knowing more, but of knowing how we know. And in that quiet realization lies the key to lifelong growth. For thousands of years, learning lived in books, on scrolls, in minds, and in memory. But now, it lives in something else. Invisible, instant, everywhere. The digital mind is here. If someone from just 100 years ago stepped into today's world, they might be more shocked by how we learn than by what we know. Not because we are smarter, but because our tools have changed everything. We no longer wait for a teacher. We don't always turn to a book. We open a browser. We type a question, and answers appear. The internet has become a new kind of brain, a vast, ever-growing field of facts, opinions, images, voices. It remembers for us. It speaks every language. It connects us to people we will never meet. And now, with artificial intelligence, we can not only receive knowledge, but interact with it. We can ask, revise, reframe. We can simulate, imagine, translate, test. AI doesn't just give answers. It becomes a kind of mirror for our own thinking. But what does this mean for the future of learning? At first glance, it might seem like the end of education. If machines can know everything, why should we learn anything? But that question misses something essential. Because learning was never just about knowing. It was about understanding, about connection, about becoming more human. And in a digital world, that goal remains. Technology can give access. It can break down walls of geography, cost, and ability. A child in a remote village can now watch a university lecture. A teenager can code, create music, learn a language, all from a phone. But access alone is not enough. We must also teach how to think, how to filter, how to question, how to reflect. Because the internet is wide, but not always deep. And AI is fast, but not always wise. So the role of the learner has changed. We are no longer just receivers. We are navigators. We must learn to move through oceans of information with purpose, with care, with curiosity. And teachers, they are not replaced. They are reimagined. They become guides, mentors, designers of experience. And education? It becomes lifelong, not limited to childhood, not bound to school walls, but part of who we are every day. The digital mind is not a threat to human learning. It is a challenge, an invitation, a partner. And if we meet it with intention, with compassion, with vision, it can become the most powerful tool for understanding we have ever known. We've followed the story of learning from the first spark of curiosity to the digital breath of today's world. And yet, the story isn't over. Because the mind never truly stops. It rests. It dreams. But it always listens. And it always asks. Learning began before we had words, before we built schools, before we held books in our hands or screens in our palms. It began in the eyes of a child watching a bird, in the hands of a hunter studying tracks, in the breath of a mother teaching her child a song that would guide them home. We learned to survive, to feed, to find shelter, to count the days and follow the stars. But soon, we learned more. We learned to ask why, to wonder, to imagine, to reach beyond what was needed and into what was meaningful. From firelight to fiber optics, from cave walls to code, we have always tried to understand the world and ourselves just a little more. And through every age, one truth remains. We are not just beings that learn. We are made of learning. It is not something we do. It is something we are. In our questions, our mistakes, our memories, and our moments of quiet realization, the mind moves, grows, shifts. It carries every lesson, every story, every discovery forward, not just for survival, but for connection, for creativity, for love, for truth. So whether you are young or old, whether you study in a classroom, a forest, a workshop, or your own thoughts, know this: your curiosity is sacred, your questions are brave, and your willingness to learn, even now, even here, even as you fall asleep, is a quiet act of courage. So as this day fades and your thoughts begin to soften, let this truth remain. You are enough. You are learning. And you are not alone. Tonight, may your dreams be gentle, your mind be still, and your heart open. Sleep well, dear listener, and never stop wondering. Good night.